why are we here? Are we here to make profit so that the shareholders and certainly our owners can line their pockets? And if that's the only reason for being, actually that's quite depressing. If we are here for a much wider, greater good, which is to lift the social well-being and livelihoods of everybody that works for us and through our supply chain, that is a very different perspective. And actually, I think that if you were to re-engineer business to think in that way, then what you would do and the actions you would take would be quite different.
Just last week, Rachel was named as one of the 30 people changing the face of fashion in the most epic ways by Glamour magazine. She is a sustainability and innovation consultant focused on how to bring systems-level change to the fashion industry, covering new business models, supply chain transformation, and storytelling. She is also a co-founder of the global community shaping the future of fashion, FashMash. By background, she's an award-winning business journalist. In this episode, you'll hear about Rachel's journey of going conscious, how she got swept up in the heady world of fashion, and then, with the help of Bali, meditation and yoga, she reawakened to her mission of driving sustainability and change. Rachel and I first met back in London 5 years ago when I was still working in fashion too, when I was introduced to the FashMash network. We've been in touch ever since, and sustainability has always been an important topic for us both. In this episode, we talk about how to connect with your bigger, meaningful goal, not just making other people more money, learning how to say no to anything you don't believe in, the full system change the fashion industry needs as it is so detrimental to people and the planet, and how to fundamentally rethink capitalism. Rachel, hi.
Hi, Nikki. So good to be here.
Really happy to have you on Going Conscious. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this.
First thing I guess I want to ask you is really around your journey and where you've come from, your journalistic background, focusing on fashion, being a co-founder of FashMash, and then moving towards your absolute passion for sustainability in everything that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, as I suppose most people, it's been a bit of an interesting journey. I think I've kind of always had somewhat of a sustainability focus underneath. It's been a bit of a red thread through my career, and I've gone back to it every now and again. As a journalist, I have some clippings from some newspapers of the early noughties writing about sustainability in fashion, which obviously is or was so early within this whole conversation. But I kind of abandoned it somewhat, and that now feels really naive. And I think it's just that I got very swept up in the almost heady world that fashion can be. And I think I kind of just had a bit of a reawakening to it several years ago, and now been really trying to focus my work on this wholeheartedly. And I think that was just the experience of having, been in this industry that is so oh God, it's so hard to even find the right words for it. But it is in so many ways just I don't want to use the word frivolous, because actually that's one thing that I argued against it being when I did a TED talk a few years ago. But there is something about it that doesn't feel that it has enough meaning to it, and that makes you feel as though there needs to be a lot of change and a lot of difference, because this industry can be really powerful and positive. And I felt that the work I was doing as a consultant, having been a journalist, as you say, by background, was very heavily focused on innovation, but it was innovation that was incremental. And I just found that a lot of what I was doing wasn't really making much difference ultimately. And what I wanted to do was kind of stop and ask myself why I was doing it and what I wanted to achieve. Was it just about driving more money for the industry? Was it about driving more money for myself? And ultimately, did that motivate me either way round? And it didn't. And what did motivate me was this idea of changing the industry for the better and trying to improve something that is so fundamentally damaging, such a huge contributor to the climate and ecological crisis, that as citizens, I believe now that we really have no choice but to all be focused on, not least because we have such a short amount of time to actually make the kind of difference that's needed. So that's kind of why I've pivoted, even though I think underneath there's been something in me that's always wanted to be fully focused on this. So I'm very pleased to now have the good fortune of being able to wholeheartedly.
So you said that 3 years ago was when you went back to the sustainability focus. Was there any key moment or influence that moved you towards this sustainability path?
So I think the sustainability work had been going on for sort of a good 5 years or so before that as well, in some form or another. But being able to pivot to it entirely was actually to do with quite a lot of personal moments and personal experiences. And it's a complete cliche, and I'm sure that listeners will laugh. I'm sure you will laugh. But I spent some time in Bali. I went on a yoga retreat. I did lots of meditation. I sort of, for want of a better phrase, or maybe it's the perfect phrase, was able to hit a reset and find what made sense to myself. So the phrase being, found myself, I suppose, or found my center, and was able to sort of level out some anxiety that I was having, and tried to just make sense of the world. And that place and that experience gave me the opportunity, I think, to do that, and enabled me to sort of lay out all the pieces of my career and what I had been doing, and understand why I was doing it. So, as I say, complete cliche, but Bali for me was a complete reset and a moment in time that I'll never forget for what it was able to let me see.
And so what were some of those things that you saw then in Bali that helped you to center?
I mean, I think the majority of it was, as I was saying, this notion of, why are you doing what you're doing? And you spend so much of your career pushing and pushing and pushing and working crazy hours and going after things constantly and being on this hamster wheel. And then you're not really sure why at the end of the day. It's quite depressing in many ways. You think, am I just in this to help other people make a lot of money? And if that's ultimately all it is that something that personally makes me happy? And I think you recognize that it doesn't. And then on top of that, the sort of understanding of how much damage that does to the environment, but also to people's livelihoods in other places around the world, is an eye-opener. I think once you understand the pure facts that sit there, the statistics around this and all of that, that in itself is enough of an awakening to make you realize that you cannot keep working in something that is just helping to sort of build on that, making it worse in so many ways. So it was all of those things combined, really.
So how could you then take your step towards a different path from that place you were in?
I mean, I think I was quite fortunate. As I said, I had really been working in it already in quite a capacity. As most people, I didn't have the luxury of being able to 100% step away at that moment in time from the work I was doing. But I started making small steps in the right direction to taking the work that I believed in the most, and sort of what's happened since and more recently is that I've been in a fortunate enough position in my sort of personal life to be able to absolutely say no to things that I don't believe in, and really only work on projects that I believe are in themselves transformative, game changing, really feeding into this notion of changing the system that this industry is built on. And that it's quite a big jump, I think, well, for anybody, but certainly for myself in this capacity, to recognize that it's okay to step away from things that aren't actually feeding into that bigger goal and aren't ultimately something that you want to be part of. And that's been a learning throughout my whole career, as it is for many people. But I think especially when you've been self-employed, and I've had quite a few pockets in my career where I have done self-employment for a while and been freelance as a journalist or been a contractor as a consultant. And, you take on many things. I remember very early on in my journalism career, and I took on some freelance work as a copywriter, and not to criticize copywriters because there are some excellent ones out there in the world, but it was not for me at all. And it was only after writing some copy for a website about pets that I realized I really didn't want to be a copywriter, because it was not the most interesting experience, let's put it that way. And so, those moments in time where you recognize that it's okay to say, what, that's not for me. It's not actually feeding into my goals, or it's not making me happy, and everything else has been something, I think, that again I've gained from throughout all of this over time. And now I constantly try and go back to and say, if I take this on, am I going to be grateful for having done so down the road, or is it going to feed into one of my bigger objectives and aims that I have? And if it doesn't, then walk away from it.
So really getting clarity on what you say yes and no to. And you mentioned, you ask yourself, does this feed into my bigger objectives? Are you able to share what those bigger objectives look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as I said, this notion of, is this work transformative? You know, for me, the fashion industry is so detrimental in every single sense that it isn't as simple as fixing one little part of it or several little parts of it. You know, it's not enough to just be doing incremental work. It's about thinking of this whole notion of a system. And so that's why we talk about this idea of systems change, which is, you know, a phrase that's often attached to sustainability at large, because the objectives here are so massive to fundamentally transform an industry and indeed society full stop, that you have to look at the whole and not just the individual parts, or you have to look at how those individual parts feed into the whole. So it's very hard, but I try and put things through that lens. Is this work that I'm doing something that inputs and impacts the system change that is needed in a wider sense? And so, you know, some of that, it's very easy to be like, you know, no, this is incredibly incremental. There's absolutely no way that this is going to fundamentally transform the industry. And sometimes it's okay to say this can transform this part of a business, or this can transform this business at large, even if it doesn't necessarily change society. That's almost too big an objective, I think, for one individual person and indeed for one individual fashion brand. But that's kind of the lens I try and put it through. You know, is this work meaningful? Is it transformative? Can it lead towards a bigger goal? And I'm early in that journey with the actual projects I've been able to take on, but I've been very fortunate that I've had some very positive ones land on my lap. Well, I think I've worked hard for them too, but they have ultimately, come to me, which has been brilliant. That I do truly believe are looking to achieve that, which is very exciting.
So how has things changed for you in your life and business since you've been using this filter for every project decision that you make?
God, that's a good question. I mean, I think I probably have a bit more of a sense of grounding, and I definitely don't have it figured out. I'm not sure that everybody does as yet. You know, I love this theme of your podcast and talking to this idea of going conscious, but I think that the fact that the word going is really important there, because it sounds like it is part of a process and it's a journey. It's not something that just immediately happens. And so I think I'm still in that. But certainly it's felt as though there's more of a sense of calm, that what I'm doing is towards a larger goal, as opposed to just fighting month by month to make enough money. And don't get me wrong, I know that is a luxury position to be in, where it's not fundamentally just about making ends meet. It's about thinking a little bit wider than that in terms of it actually being more personally meaningful to me. So as I say, it's certainly a luxury position to be in, but it's brought me a sense of calm, knowing that what I'm doing is something that I believe in, and it's not just for the sake of it. And I suppose what I mean in there, more importantly, it's not just for the sake of helping other people make a lot of money, when there's so many parts of the industry that are then damaged because of that.
And so when you talk about system change, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you don't mind, maybe one of the easiest ways is to explain one of the projects that I'm working on, because I think hopefully that helps to kind of illustrate it a little bit.
Yes, please.
So when I talk about systems change, as I say, it's this notion of, you know, how can something that we're doing start to impact the whole system that needs changing? So if you look at something like the fashion industry, if we say, you know what, fashion weeks are not working, we need to reduce the number of shows, or we need to reduce the amount of travel that people do to the shows because of the carbon footprint that uses by doing so. That in itself, to me, is too small an ask, because by just changing the way that the shows are and moving them, for instance, online, what you're not doing is changing the very notion of consumption. You know, you're still encouraging people to buy more stuff constantly, and as a result, even though you've tweaked one little part, that shift is just an incremental one, because the system at large remains the same. And that system is all about, obviously, consumerism and pushing more and more product. So that's one example of how I think it can tweak. One of the pieces I'm working on, which is in a totally different space but is related, is to say, if we look at the whole way the industry is structured, and you look at the supply chain, one of the biggest issues that exists in this industry is that the supply chain is really highly fragmented, and the majority of brands and businesses within this do not have full visibility on what happens down the supply chain. And that means that they can shirk a lot of the responsibility. So, they may be able to see their immediate garment manufacturers, but they don't necessarily see the fabric manufacturer, let alone much further before that, looking back at the farm, for instance, where, as one example, the cotton would be farmed. And what's incredibly interesting about that, as I say, is about shirking responsibility. And part of that obviously is around the social side of the industry and the actual welfare of the workers themselves, as well as that is the environmental side. And what we know is that for the fashion industry, and there are different statistics around this, but one of the ones most favorably used is this idea that around 60 to 70% of environmental impact happens at the raw material stage. So that is, as I said, for example, when the cotton is being farmed. But there are, the majority of fashion brands not only cannot see back to that stage, but certainly have no influence or power over it at all. And that, as I say, means that they can just get rid of the need to sort of be responsible for it. And that fundamentally is when we come back to this idea of a system, right? Because that all feeds into this one system, which is pushing for us to buy more and more product, especially at the fast fashion level. And yet the damage is done so early on in the chain that that's a massive negative. So the project I've been working on is with Google. I've been working on it for over 18 months now. And what we essentially did is we looked at the fashion industry as a whole and said, okay, where can Google's technology and data play a role to help shift this industry in a positive way towards change? And that essentially meant that we landed on this raw material stage of the whole process and recognized that if we were to bring some more data to that stage to help people truly understand what happens there and the environmental impact that takes place. When I say that, it's things like the amount of water used and the air pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions, all of that. If you could start to understand it properly, you'd be able to see not only how bad it is, but you'd be able to see how to make more informed decisions, more responsible decisions. So you'd be able to identify, okay, I shouldn't necessarily be buying conventional cotton. Maybe I should be buying only organic cotton, which, the industry already knows that, but it's still a very small proportion of people that do it because there's only so much of it farmed around the world. So how can we help encourage farmers, for instance, and importantly, support them to be able to make that change? And that becomes more and more interesting when you start looking at things like regenerative agriculture and, protecting biodiversity and all sorts of things that we hope by building this tool, and that's what it will be, a sort of an online platform to help people identify their raw material sourcing and the impact that is being had. By building that, we can help towards the whole system and shifting it and changing the way that fashion thinks about what they actually create in the first place.
So do you think that this is something that brands truly want to address and change when they're still ultimately motivated by profit and shareholders?
I think it depends what way you come to it. There is definitely motivation there to change. I think part of that is through people that are genuinely motivated to want to do so through their own feelings about it. There are a lot of people that obviously are pressured to do so now as well by the fact that this has obviously become such a big topic of conversation and the industry is recognizing that there's no choice but to shift. I do think it's a slightly different perspective when we actually start looking at the economics of it and the shareholders. And I don't think we are yet there at all that we would let it detriment profit, which I think is one of the biggest issues that exists here. But when it comes to this specific project itself, this really is about trying to implement change with the doers within the business. Does that mean that it might be, very evident that they need to spend more money on sourcing? Quite possibly. And I think that's part of our hope, is that by building something that is so fundamentally transparent, it will make these businesses more accountable on these decisions so that they can look at it and say, I have to spend more money, or we have to find a way of rethinking our margins on these things because we cannot keep doing it the way we have been doing. And hopefully my ultimate wish is that shareholders start to hold them accountable to that as well. And I do think that is slowly starting to shift in some of the sort of more progressive businesses.
So does this transparency in this project also have an implication for consumers?
So I do think it can do. The ultimate goal is really for it to be for businesses. It will be an online tool that anybody can access, however. So that makes it quite interesting. Whether a consumer really will be able to look at this and understand how buying that many kilos of whatever material it is, I keep using cotton as the example because it's the easiest one to comprehend. But, if it's viscose or polyester or nylon, whatever it might be, comprehend if you buy this many kilos, this is the amount of impact that has. Can we sort of translate that into, what that means for a t-shirt or a dress or a pair of jeans? Not necessarily. And I'm not sure the tool will get to the point where that's the intention, because there are so many further stages that it needs to go through beyond the actual farming of it and the raw materials. Once it goes through the whole process, maybe it gets dyed and it gets washed and it obviously gets cut and sewn and everything else. And point being that there's much more environmental impact that happens, and then it gets shipped to you, etc. And we're not working on all of those further stages, largely because there are a lot of others already doing that piece of work. And hopefully at some point we'll be able to connect all of these tools together. But there's nothing stopping a consumer from being able to look at this. And hopefully long term, and again, there are others working on this, there will be a way that when you buy a t-shirt in a store, you would be able to know what impact that has had overall comparative to another one in another store, so that you yourself are making more informed decisions as well. That is a rather large goal because it is so fundamentally complex, but it's nice to think that we could get there, because I do think that would help to shift consumer behavior quite substantially.
If you enjoy Going Conscious, please subscribe for a new episode every Wednesday. If you think your friends, colleagues, or peers would benefit from Going Conscious, please share it with them and help spread this message of fulfillment and freedom. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review. It's great to read what you think, and this makes a big difference. Your support means so much. As well as hosting Going Conscious, I work as a transformation coach and can help you transition in business and relationships as you unleash your purpose and full potential. I also work as a conscious brand consultant and can help your company make a bigger positive impact. You can discover more about my one-on-one and group transformation coaching programs and conscious brand consulting on my website, nikkitrott.com, or on Instagram @nikkitrott. Please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you, and let's talk about your path of growth and transformation. And so, how do you see the role of the brand and the role of the consumer, and how they play together or potentially clash in this move towards a more sustainable fashion industry?
I mean, I think this is kind of the biggest complexity that sits here, really, is how we start to sort of pull these things apart and understand what are the levers for change that exist within all of this. And there are many different angles that you can come at it from. But, at the end of the day, for the level of change that's needed, we need to be looking at both production and consumption. So we know fundamentally the fashion industry produces way too much. It's something like 100 billion items of clothing a year. The statistics vary. Some say 80, some say 150, but roughly around 100 billion items a year. So that is completely nuts. And then when you look at the amount of waste that comes out the back of that, it's a very large percentage as well. But that waste sits at lots of different points within the whole chain. So there is, the things that get left over on the sort of the materials and things that get wasted on the factory floor. There is the waste that never gets sold, so sits in the warehouses and it goes on sale, and it's what we call dead stock. It never ever shifts, and ultimately, likewise, ends up in landfill, or it, in worst case scenarios, still in many places around the world, gets incinerated. And then you obviously have the consumer who buys loads and loads of stuff. And obviously the amount that we buy has radically changed. And I can't remember the statistics here, but it's something like we've doubled the amount we've purchased since the year 2000. Like, it's insane how much more we buy now just over the last 20 years. So within all of our lifetimes, which is crazy. And then obviously there's the amount that we also throw away. And all of those things combined just mean that there's so much extra stuff. So we need to change the amount that is produced in the first place and start, reducing it so there isn't so much waste. But we also need a way that the consumer recognizes that they don't need to buy as much. And that by doing that would also mean that we decrease the amount we've produced. But what we're fundamentally asking the industry to do then is scale down. And that's a massive conversation, because it's not something that many businesses are willing to even talk about, because of course they are measured by the fact that they grow.
And so you mentioned about needing consumers to realize that they can buy less and that they need to buy less. How do you think we could approach that?
It's really difficult. I mean, we are seeing it happen slowly. If you look at the sort of statistics that are out there now about the amount of consumers that are willing to think through a sustainable lens, that is increasing. Those numbers are going up. I think we're still very much with early adopters for that being adopted in a literal sense. So basically by that, I mean those that say it versus those that then do it, and still being a little bit disconnected. But that's quite normal when you're in an early adopter conversation. But we are seeing that curve increase, and that is particularly the case with some of the, for want of a better phrase, more fashionable areas. So things like single-use plastics. Obviously, David Attenborough made that the big topic of conversation, and the whole world has gone quite crazy for recognizing, or certainly Western world developed markets, recognizing that single-use plastics are negative, and we need to not use single plastic bags, and we need to not use these plastic straws and plastic coffee cups and so on. And that's a good thing, that kind of awareness drives change, and that's a real positive. But I don't think people yet comprehend the same sort of thing when they pull on a polyester dress as being essentially from the same root source. But I do think that it is evolving. However, I don't think from my perspective that I fundamentally believe that it is on the consumer to change. I think at the moment that's a really good excuse for businesses to not do anything by saying, oh, the consumer's not there yet. They're not that interested, so therefore we don't have to do it. Whereas actually, I think that the issue is so big now that we have to. This industry is growing at such pace consistently, and as a result, the negative environmental impact is as well. So I think by the year 2030, it's estimated that the fashion industry will produce 50% more greenhouse gas emissions than it does currently. And that is pretty mind-blowing, considering we are supposed to be moving towards being more sustainable. So within all of that, we then have to think about, okay, how can we change away from it? And that, to me, has to mean that we as a business, as an industry, have to start fundamentally making the shifts, as opposed to waiting for the consumer to do so themselves. And I think it's weak to say that the consumer isn't ready for it, or, look at the consumer queuing up outside stores as they reopen post the coronavirus lockdowns around the world. And that shows that, all they want to do is shop and everything else. And I think that is a sort of naivety, or as I say, very good excuse for inertia. And I don't think it's good enough fundamentally.
Okay. And so taking it back to you, Rachel, and your journey towards consciousness and to your more sustainable work, how has that been for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard question. I guess it's really been around understanding what of this I really care about, and how can I ensure that the work I'm doing isn't just feeding into this sense of incrementalism as well. I think fundamentally sustainability as a movement, as a revolution, has to feed into every single thing that we do. So it's about walking the talk as well, trying to bring that into my own life as well as into my work, and thinking about, how can I really truly be driving change, and also what's needed. It's very trendy, for want again of a better word, to work in this space now. So how can I ensure what I'm doing is ultimately a net positive to this whole shift that's needed? And as I say, I think I'm still figuring that out, but I'm trying to very, very strictly stick to my goals and make sure that I'm only doing things that I believe are complementary to it.
So how do you bring this into your own life then, into your personal life and the way that you choose to live?
One of the biggest shifts for me has just been around, the way that I myself shop. So, if I look at fashion specifically, it really is around, not buying fast fashion. And I was a massive fast fashion consumer, when I was younger, in my teens and in my 20s. And it's almost quite shameful now to think back to the volume of product that I bought, and the fact that I worked in a coffee shop, one of my first jobs, and with some of my best friends from school, and every Saturday afternoon we'd finish, and every single week we would take our earnings and we would go into the local fast fashion stores and buy a new top or a skirt or something for the same evening to then go out with our friends. And we did that every single week, and obviously that grew and grew, but that was kind of the norm, if you will. That was just standard consumer behavior, and it still is for many people. And I think for me, it's been about removing myself from that feeling of want and need, and recognizing that actually those material items don't fundamentally actually make me feel better about myself, even if it might for a moment in time make you think that you look nice in the mirror. And recognizing that actually you already have a wardrobe of things that you believed did that a while ago. So it's about revisiting them. So fundamentally reducing, full stop, the amount that I buy. And then when I do buy, really trying to think through a different lens of what I need and where I can get it from. So buying lots secondhand, and thinking about things like the rental market. If I have an event, and I obviously do a relative amount of speaking opportunities for work, and I always try and rent something when I do so. And I particularly try and rent things that I also believe in that brand and the move that they're making, so that I can promote them alongside. So that's the biggest thing. And I've recently had a baby, and I'm doing the same thing with what I buy him. Everything is secondhand, and there's rental baby markets and things like that. And it's quite exciting actually, because there's a whole new world of opportunity for thinking a little bit differently. And in many ways, it's a relatively privileged position to be in, to have the time to and the money to be able to ensure that you do it in a way that you do believe in. But I think this space is shifting so fast, so fundamentally, that there are increasing opportunities for everybody to be able to do so.
That's great. Yeah, the growth of the rental market is amazing.
It really is. It really, really is. There's so much happening, so many exciting startups working in it, so many thoughtful approaches to what opportunity is out there. And it's great for the consumer as well, because you have access to these beautiful products that you may never have had before, that you can now wear to a wedding or whatever it is, rather than collecting all these dresses in your own wardrobe that you've worn once or twice and they never see the light of day again.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned that fashion and fast fashion was used for you and your friends in a way to make yourselves feel better. And as you realize that this doesn't make you feel better, how's that change your perspective, and what does make you feel good?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I guess. And maybe part of that is just, getting older and thinking about things through a different lens. It's not about putting clothes on to try and impress other people. I think that comes with maturity anyway. But, I do think that there's a lot of shift happening, full stop. And I hope that generation that is now in the sort of teenage and early 20 years are similarly starting to evolve in the same way, or pockets of them anyway, as I say, these early adopters. What makes me feel happy now? God, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think and maybe this again is about, moving towards middle age very swiftly and thinking around, family and time together and all of those moments, and less so about actually what you look like. And as I say, trying to impress other people. And I think it's a product of, this kind of industry, and obviously things like advertising that surrounds it. We are basically fed as consumers this notion of having something new is what brings happiness. And obviously, I think all of us have recognized that that's not the case, but then it perpetuates it further, because, then we're not happy the following day. So we go and buy something again, and it goes on and on and on. That's the society that, the construct that surrounds surrounds us, essentially. It's what feeds into capitalism at the end of the day. And I do think that it's having somewhat of a reckoning, and that's a good thing.
And so for you, in your world and in your work, what does success look like now?
Change, I think. Anything that is leading towards transformation in some capacity or another, I think is what is fundamentally what is needed. At the end of the day, there are some very big goals for everybody around the world, full stop, that industry feeds into through the Paris Agreement to fundamentally reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do so that global warming stays below this 1.5 degree Celsius increase, that threshold. That is a massive, massive task to be able to do that within ideally the next 10 years. And thus, I think there's a responsibility on everybody to be sure that what they are doing is in some way contributing, or I suppose, reducing that contribution, essentially. So for me, it's that ultimately. It's around, success for me is how can we drive change in a way that leads to the protection of our planet and ultimately the protection of life as humans, full stop, as a result. So anything at all that can help drive that in some capacity or another is crucial. And that does mean a fundamental shift away from thinking about being driven by money first. And that's for me in my personal life, as I've explained. But I also think it has to start being a drive for the industry as well, to not put profit as the number one goal, and to think about these other areas, people and planet, as being, certainly as crucial, if not fundamentally more so in an ideal world. That's the change that we need to see.
And do you think it's possible that we will see industry changing to putting people and planet at least on the same level as profit, if not above?
I mean, there's certainly headway being made in this. There are a lot of players that are really trying to think about, how do they, put all of these things together within their goals. There's a lot of, for example, businesses that are moving to be B Corp certified, which does exactly that. It essentially makes them as accountable to the planet and people as they are to profit. It's really difficult because it's a massive shift. It's a huge change within a business, but it's obviously a massive change within society, full stop. This is everywhere around the world. In the majority, we are driven by this idea of GDP growth, which is now a relatively old-fashioned view, but it is the one that underpins every single thing that we fundamentally know, which is to say that growth is good. The more the economy is growing, so-called, the better we are doing as people. That's proven in many instances to not be the case, but it is still fundamentally believed in. And the challenge with that is obviously the amount of impact it has. And if you take the fashion industry as a very basic example of it, everything that we're doing in sustainability right now, and this is what's blown my mind the most and made me think so fundamentally about how can we truly be driving change. Everything we're doing in sustainability right now is being outpaced by the growth the industry is having. So in other words, even when we see really positive projects happening, there isn't any overall net reduction in the impact that the industry is having because of the size of its growth. And that's really scary to think of, that, we're growing so fast. I think the growth is expected to be something like 81% from now until the year 2030. That's mind-blowing when you think about it in terms of volume. So it's, as I say, it's really scary. And that to me just brings us back to this idea that, the industry therefore needs to not grow. It needs to scale back. It needs to produce less. I've written a lot about this. This is the elephant in the room. Ultimately, as somebody told me that I interviewed, this is an anathema to fashion to think that it can scale back and produce less. But it has to. And I think what's interesting is when we start to look at it within the bigger picture of society as a whole, fundamentally, we need to not look at GDP as a measure of growth. I believe we need to have other indicators that do take into account some of the costs, obviously, of things like, the extraction from nature and so forth, and obviously the people side of things as well, social well-being and so forth. How do we sort of build that into the way that we measure things fundamentally? But also, how do we then say, okay, if we need material throughput to reduce, which is what the fashion industry is so fundamentally part of, that doesn't mean that necessarily other types of industries need to reduce. So for fashion, then there could be enormous opportunity around things like services and experiences. And that changes the game, because it just means about thinking really differently about what we're trying to be here for. And that for me is the ultimate question. Why? That's the question I've asked myself, like, why do I exist within this industry? What am I trying to do? And I think it's important that brands ask themselves the same. Why are we here? Are we here to make profit so that the shareholders and certainly our owners can line their pockets? And if that's the only reason for being, actually, that's quite depressing. If we are here for a much wider, greater good, which is to lift the social well-being and livelihoods of everybody that works for us and through our supply chain, that is a very different perspective. And actually, I think that if you were to re-engineer business to think in that way, then what you would do and the actions you would take would be quite different. So for me, it's about tipping everything on its head and thinking around things through a very different lens, and recognizing that there are some much wider things that we can contribute to here that ultimately drive in the same way towards progress. Whether that can be adopted at scale is a completely different question, because it really does mean fundamentally rethinking what capitalism is. But I think we're at a moment in time right now where that need has never been greater, but also the opportunity has never been presented before us in such a clear way. And I hope that means that some people will be willing to grab hold of that and run with it. And I'm just trying to be part of that as it's happening, because I think it's so crucial that it does.
Well, it's certainly a huge task, but it's terrifying to hear about the 81% growth by 2030 that it is expected. But it's also amazing to see how much innovation is happening in this area and how much momentum it's gaining and wider awareness in general.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we come to the end of our chat today, I want to ask you, is there a book you read recently which is particularly interesting or inspiring to you?
I've got two. So they all sort of feed into this topic I've been talking about, and this notion of how we sort of rethink capitalism. So one is called Prosperity Without Growth. That's by Tim Jackson. So that's really looking at post-growth economics, super interesting. And the one I'm reading at the moment, which I'm loving, is John Elkington's Green Swans, The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism. Also really, really fascinating, just rethinking all of it. So I'd highly recommend both if you're at all interested in this subject.
And then last question, do you have a takeaway message or a closing comment you want to share?
Just that I think it's okay to think differently. We need to. We kind of live in this world where we don't think it's possible to do any different from what we've always known. And I think now is the moment to say, actually, it's not working. It's broken. Let's change it. So yeah, let's do it.
Amazing. That's so inspiring. Thank you, Rachel. So where can our listeners find you online?
I'm everywhere online. Easiest place, best place, probably where I'm most vocal is LinkedIn. Please add me there. I look forward to connecting with you and talking to you and everything else.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. I've really enjoyed our chat today.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
I love how Rachel talks about her journey of going conscious as a process, something which takes time to unfold. I think that when we look back on changes we have made, we can clearly see how the threads fit together and lead us down our path. But when we're in the midst of making a change, the picture is not always so clear. It can be hard. Still, by listening to our intuition, we can trust that we are making the decisions and changes that we need to. Sometimes we can be so distracted by external influences that we forget that we already have our answers within. As Rachel said, we must all think differently. Rachel's definition of success as driving change that protects our planet and therefore humans is a great example of the shift in mindset that we are seeing across the world. Success no longer means profit and power over health and harmony, as more people are waking up and inviting a whole new success into their lives, which brings them fulfillment and freedom too. When it comes to fashion, this conversation with Rachel got me wondering, what would happen if the fashion industry just stopped producing clothes today? With the 100 billion garments that are produced every single year now, don't we already have enough clothing on this planet to comfortably dress every human for longer than we will even be in this human form for? Of course, the person to pose this question to is Rachel, so I've asked her to have a look into it, and we'll share what we find on Instagram soon, at Nikki Trott and at Rachel Arthur. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe now where you're listening. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating and short review. Your support really means a lot. I personally get my information and inspiration from podcasts which are shared with me. So if you think your friends and networks might benefit from listening to Going Conscious, please share it with them. Let's spread this positive message of fulfillment and freedom together. For all episodes, a library of books and podcasts recommended by my guests, show notes, and more about me and my work, visit goingconscious.com. As well as creating Going Conscious, I work as a transformation coach and can help you to transition in business and relationships as you unleash your purpose and full potential. I can also help your company make a bigger positive impact with bespoke conscious brand consulting projects. To connect with me and find out more about my programs and services, find me on Instagram at Nikki Trott or on my website, nikkitrott.com. I'd love to hear from you and talk about your transition and transformation. DM me on Instagram or email me through my website if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to discuss working with me. And if I don't hear from you before then, see you next Wednesday on the next episode of Going Conscious. As always, live your freedom.